I grew up in a house where it was crystal clear who the star was. And it wasn't me, my sister Bethany. She was the golden child, straight A's, cheerleading captain, homecoming queen, the whole damn package. My parents practically worshipped her. Me? I was just Arthur, the reliable one, the responsible one. If Bethany brought home a B+, my parents would shrug it off. She's just under a lot of pressure, they'd say, like she was single-handedly carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. If I brought home a B+, I'd get a lecture about wasted potential. Potential I apparently wasn't living up to. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't some resentful little snot. I didn't envy Bethany, not really. I was too busy carving my own path. I worked part-time at a local auto shop, greasy hands and all, saved every penny, and planned my future. I wanted to go to college. Big dreams, you know? I wanted to study business, build something from the ground up. I'd always been fascinated by how people like Musk and Bezos could take an idea and turn it into an empire. I wanted that, and I was doing it. I'd applied to my dream school, State University, and got in. Scholarships, grants, the whole 9 yards. Everything was on track. I could practically taste the freedom, the independence. Then, bam. My parents called a family meeting. Red flags immediately went up. Family meetings weren't exactly a regular occurrence in the Peterson household. Usually, it was just Bethany getting praised for something, or me getting a thinly veiled lecture. I figured it had something to do with Bethany. She'd recently moved back home after her marriage imploded. Things hadn't been good for a while, I knew that. Bethany and her husband, Mark, were constantly fighting. She'd brought her 2 kids, little Chloe and even littler Leo, back with her a few weeks earlier. A total chaotic situation. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd ask me to help out a little more around the house. Maybe watch the kids for an hour or 2. What I didn't expect was for them to ask me to throw my entire future away. We were all crammed into the living room. The air was thick with unspoken tension. You know the kind. Mom and Dad were sitting on the couch. Bethany was slumped in an armchair, scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention. I sat on the opposite end, fiddling with the rip in my jeans, a bad habit of mine when I was nervous. "Arthur," my father started, his voice overly serious. "We need to talk about college." "Okay," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Mom jumped in, her face tight. "We've been doing some thinking. With everything going on, this may not be the right time for you to go." My stomach dropped. "Wait, what? What are you talking about?" "I've already been accepted. I've been planning this for years." I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Dad crossed his arms, nodding as if bracing for my reaction. "We know, son, but things have changed. Bethany's struggling. She needs us. We can't do this alone, Arthur." I stared at them in disbelief. "You're seriously telling me not to go to college just because Bethany can't handle her own life?" I wanted to scream, but I choked it down. This was my life they were talking about, not some board game. "She's going through a lot," Mom said, her voice laced with that familiar, patronizing tone. "You'll have other opportunities, but family comes first. You'll understand when you're older." It felt like a slap in the face. Family comes first. Since when? Bethany was the one who'd been partying like she was still in high school, while Mark worked himself to the bone to provide for them. Bethany was the one who blew their savings on designer handbags and useless crap. But no, it was my future that had to be sacrificed at the altar of Bethany's happiness. Again, I argued. I pleaded. I yelled. I even tried talking to Bethany directly, but she just shrugged it off, barely looking up from her phone. "It's not like I asked them to do this," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "They made the decision, not me." That didn't stop her from taking full advantage, though. Oh no. The next few months were a goddamn nightmare. I was stuck at home, babysitting Chloe and Leo while Bethany went out to blow off steam. Diapers, homework, tantrums, endless cartoons. This became my life. I didn't even recognize myself. Meanwhile, my parents praised Bethany for being so strong through the breakup. They told me I was being selfish when I got frustrated. "Bethany's under a lot of stress," they'd say, as if I wasn't drowning under the weight of their expectations. I was supposed to be the responsible one, the fixer, the one who could put his life on hold for the greater good. But I couldn't take it anymore. Every day felt like I was falling further and further into a pit from which I'd never escape. My depression hit hard. I lost weight. I couldn't sleep. Some nights I would just lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, thinking about how I'd lost everything I'd worked for. All those nights at the auto shop, inhaling fumes and getting grease under my fingernails. All that saving, all that planning, gone. One night, after Bethany came home drunk and barely acknowledged me, I snapped. I told my parents that I was done. I can't do this anymore. You want me to give it all up? Fine. But I'm not staying here. Bethany rolled her eyes. Oh, please, go ahead and leave, but don't come crawling back when you fail out there. My parents didn't even try to stop me. In fact, I think they thought I was bluffing. But I wasn't. I packed a bag that night, a few changes of clothes, my toothbrush, a crumpled photo of my grandfather, and I left. No money, no plan, no college prospects. Just the bitter reality that the people who were supposed to support me had abandoned me the moment Bethany needed them. For a long time after that, I didn't think I'd ever recover. But that was just the beginning of my story. A story that involved hard work, unexpected kindness, and a burning desire to prove them all wrong. Anyway, when I left home, I had no freaking idea where I was going. No Uber, no Bolt, I didn't even have enough money for a motel. The first few nights were spent sleeping on a park bench near a park where I used to play as a kid. Kind of poetic, I guess. It was one of those moments when you realize how quickly life can turn upside down. One day you're fighting with your parents, the next you're wondering where your next meal is coming from. I tried to keep my chin up, told myself it was an adventure. But the gnawing hunger, the bone-chilling nights, the constant fear of being harassed by the cops, it wore me down pretty fast. I felt so isolated. I knew I had to do something. I swallowed my pride and reached out to some friends from high school, sent out a bunch of texts explaining my situation, begging for help. Most of them gave me vague excuses. Sorry, man, things are tight right now. My parents wouldn't understand. They didn't want to get involved in my family drama. I get it, but it still stung. Except for one, Ryan. He was an old friend from high school. We hadn't been super close, but we always got along. He was a genuinely good guy. When I told him what had happened, he didn't even hesitate. Man, this is messed up, he said, his voice full of genuine concern. You can stay at my place for now. It's a one-bedroom, so you'll have to take the couch. But it's better than the park, right? Better than the park? It was a freaking palace compared to the park. I practically choked on my gratitude. Ryan, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Seriously. I stayed with Ryan for a couple of months. I worked whatever jobs I could find. Construction, stocking shelves at a grocery store, even cleaning offices at night. I barely slept, but I was determined not to crawl back to my parents, like Bethany had so gleefully predicted. The work was brutal, physically demanding, but the hardest part was the emotional toll. I'd hear other people my age talking about college, or internships, or career plans, and it was like a knife twisting in my gut. This was supposed to be me. One night, after a particularly brutal 12-hour shift hauling drywall, I collapsed. I sat alone in the dark in Ryan's small living room staring at my phone. I almost called my parents. I thought maybe, just maybe, they would apologize. Maybe offer some kind of support. Some words of encouragement. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Deep down, I knew they wouldn't. They'd just tell me I was being dramatic, that I needed to grow up and get over it. Days turned into weeks, and I began to feel like I was running out of options. The hope that had flickered inside me was slowly dying. I was working myself to the bone, barely making enough to survive, and I felt like I was getting nowhere. That's when I met Terrence. He was one of the managers at the warehouse I was working at. A big, burly guy with a booming laugh and a surprisingly kind heart. He noticed how hard I was working, always willing to stay late, always taking on the extra shifts no one else wanted. One day he pulled me aside. Hey Arthur, you ever thought about going back to school? I laughed bitterly. I can barely pay my rent now, Terrence. College isn't in the cards for me. Terrence shook his head, his eyes full of genuine sympathy. Don't sell yourself short, man. There's always a way. Look for scholarships, grants, anything you can get your hands on. "You've got potential, kid, I can see it." Those words, they stuck with me. No one had told me I had potential in a long time. Maybe never. Not in a way that felt real, anyway. So I started looking. Late at night, after my shift ended, I'd huddle over Ryan's laptop, scouring the internet for any opportunity I could find. It was exhausting, frustrating, but I kept going. Eventually, I found a community college with a program that allowed students to work and study part-time. It wasn't state university, it wasn't my dream school, but it was a start, a way out of this dead-end cycle. I enrolled with what little savings I had left and continued to work the warehouse job to pay the bills. Those were some of the hardest years of my life. I barely had time to breathe, let alone socialize or do anything that resembled a normal life. But I was finally moving forward. I had a goal again. I promised myself I wouldn't stop until I'd built the life I'd always dreamed of. It wasn't glamorous. There were setbacks, moments when I thought about quitting, when the exhaustion and the loneliness threatened to overwhelm me. But I kept going. I kept pushing. And eventually, I earned my associate's degree. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but also the most rewarding. I still remember holding that piece of paper, the weight of it in my hands. It was more than just a degree. It was proof that I could do it, that I could overcome anything. That was the turning point. With that degree, I landed a better job. Still not glamorous, still not what I wanted, but enough to finally get out of survival mode. Over the next few years, I clawed my way up. I transferred to a state university, got my bachelor's degree in business, online, nights and weekends naturally, and eventually found myself in the corporate world. I started as a low-level analyst, crunching numbers and making coffee, but I worked my way up through sheer determination and a relentless work ethic. Promotions came slowly at first, but they came. By the time I was 26, I had a solid career. By 28, I was a regional manager for a large technology company. And at 30, I did something I never thought possible. I was named CEO of a growing startup. We were bringing in millions every month. Investors were lining up to throw money at us. My life had completely changed, and my family. They had no freaking idea. I hadn't called them. They hadn't called me. In their eyes, I was probably still struggling somewhere, bitter and directionless. I imagined them patting themselves on the back, congratulating themselves for being right about me all along. I kept up with them through mutual friends, mostly to make sure they weren't dead. I heard that Bethany was divorced, surprise, surprise, and still living with my parents. Mark wasn't paying child support, shocker, and she'd been bouncing between dead-end jobs. Part of me felt vindicated. They had bet everything on Bethany, and it had blown up in their faces. Karma's a bitch, right? But another part of me wondered if they ever thought about me at all. Did they regret what they'd done? Did they still think I was the failure they'd written off? The question stayed with me, lurking in the back of my mind, until one day, I got my answer. It began with a phone call. Okay, so the phone call. I was in my office when it happened. Glass walls, fancy furniture, the whole 9 yards. I'd just finished a meeting with our board of directors, a bunch of suits who suddenly couldn't get enough of me, when my phone started buzzing nonstop. At first, I ignored it. Calls during work hours were usually spam or business partners trying to get a piece of the pie. But then I saw the name flash on the screen. Mom. I froze. I hadn't heard from her in more than 8 years. 8 years of silence. 8 years of radio silence. Why now? What could she possibly want? My heart started pounding in my chest. Old wounds, long-buried resentments, they all came rushing to the surface. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But then another call came. Dad, then another. Bethany. They were calling me back to back. Something they'd never done before. Not even when I lived with them. This wasn't a coincidence. Something was definitely up. Curiosity, and maybe a tiny sliver of hope, got the best of me. I took a deep breath, swiped the green button, and answered the call. Oliver. Oh my God, it's really you. My mom's voice came through, a mix of surprise and excitement. We saw you on TV. You're a CEO now. How come you didn't tell us? So that was it. I'd recently been featured in a local news segment about up-and-coming business leaders. They must have seen it and suddenly remembered I existed. The prodigal son had returned and he was bringing home the bacon. I didn't say much, just let her ramble. She went on and on about how proud she was, how they'd been telling everyone how successful their son had become. I had to stop myself from laughing at the irony. They hadn't wanted me to go to college in the first place. They had actively sabotaged my dreams and now they were taking credit for my success? But I held my tongue. I wanted to see where this was going. Then she hit me with the inevitable invitation. Your dad and I would love to have you over. Maybe for dinner? You can bring your wife. We want to catch up, hear all about your life. I hesitated. A big part of me wanted to say no. After all they'd put me through, they didn't deserve to see this version of me. The one who had fought tooth and nail to succeed. They deserved to see the broken, directionless kid they'd left behind. But that's when my wife, Emily, stepped in. She'd overheard part of the call and given me that knowing look of hers. Later, she pulled me aside. You should go, she said gently, her hand resting on my arm. Family is important, even if they hurt you. Maybe they've changed. Or maybe they just want something, but you won't know if you don't give them a chance. Maybe, I muttered, unconvinced. She agreed. But you'll never know if you don't give them a chance. Besides, they're still your parents, Arthur. She was right, as usual. So, reluctantly, I agreed to visit the following weekend. The following Saturday, Emily and I drove to my parents' house. It felt surreal, like stepping back into a time capsule. Pulling into the driveway, the place hadn't changed much. Same worn shutters, same faded paint. The lawn needed to be mowed. A deflated basketball sat on the porch. Memories flooded back. Some good, most not. I could feel the tension building in my chest. I got out of the car, Emily beside me. She squeezed my hand, offering silent support. Mom greeted me at the door like a long-lost hero. She hugged me so tightly it was almost uncomfortable. Oliver, oh honey, it's so good to see you. You look so successful. Dad was more reserved, but still smiled and shook my hand. Good to see you, son. You've done well for yourself. Bethany was there too, standing awkwardly in the living room. She looked tired, older. Life hadn't been kind to her. She'd put on weight. Her hair was a mess. She still looked beautiful, but there was a fragility about her that hadn't been there before. Hey, Arthur, she said, her voice flat. Long time no see. Bethany, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. For a moment, I thought maybe things really had changed. Maybe they really wanted to reconnect, to make amends. Maybe they had finally realized the error of their ways. But then, over dinner, the truth came out. It always does, doesn't it? The small talk died down, the laughter faded, and the air grew thick with that familiar tension. I knew it was coming. I could feel it in my bones. My mom cleared her throat, put down her fork with a clatter. Oliver, she said, her voice hesitant, we need to talk about something. Here we go. I braced myself. It's Bethany, she continued. She's having trouble keeping up with the bills. The kids are growing up so fast and we thought maybe you could help out a little. You're doing so well now and you've always been good with money. There it was. The real reason they wanted me back in their lives. They needed me to bail Bethany out. The room fell silent after my mother's request. I looked around the table. My dad was nervously fidgeting with his napkin, avoiding eye contact. Bethany sat stiffly, her arms crossed as if she already expected me to say no. I could feel Emily's eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd react. I leaned back in my chair, took a sip of water. So, let me get this straight. You want me to help Bethany financially? Mom nodded quickly, eagerly. Not that we expect you to do everything, Oliver, but you're in a position to help. She's family. Family. That word. It had haunted me ever since they used it to justify tearing my life apart all those years ago. The same word they threw at me when they forced me to stay behind and sacrifice my future for Bethany's. Now they wanted me to play savior again. Before I could say anything, Bethany finally spoke. You don't have to make a big deal out of this, she said, her tone defensive. It's not like I'm asking for a handout. I just need help, for the kids. Things have been tough since the divorce. Tough? I raised an eyebrow, unable to contain myself any longer. Bethany, I know about the clubs. I know about the debt, all of it. You've been living irresponsibly for years. Her face turned red. Wow, So now you're here to judge me? I didn't ask you to come back into our lives. Enough, Mom said, trying to diffuse the tension. This isn't about the past. We're just asking you to help your sister get back on her feet. I was about to refuse outright, to tell them all to go to hell, when Emily placed her hand on mine. She gave me a subtle nod, her way of saying, "Listen to her." I sighed, tried to tamp down the anger that was boiling inside me. I softened my tone, tried to reason with them. Look, I'm not saying I won't help, but I need to understand exactly what's going on. How bad is it? Bethany hesitated before admitting, I'm behind on the mortgage, like way behind. I might lose the house. Why haven't you just moved back here? Emily asked gently, gesturing around the cramped dining room. I can't, Bethany said, her voice barely above a whisper. There's no room for me and the kids, and honestly, I needed to get out of that house. It was stifling. She glanced at our parents, her eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and something else. Maybe fear? That struck a chord with me. For years, I thought Bethany was this perfect little angel, living this perfect life. But it seemed things weren't as perfect as I'd imagined. Maybe she was stuck in a prison of her own making. Maybe our parents hadn't been the only jailers in her life. Then, something unexpected happened. My father, who had been silent all evening, finally spoke. We didn't just call you here for Bethany, he said, his voice lower than usual. There's something else. I frowned. What do you mean? He exchanged a look with Mom, who seemed suddenly uncomfortable. Your mother and we have some financial problems of our own, he admitted. Our retirement savings are gone. We had to take out a second mortgage on the house to help Bethany after the divorce. Now we're barely keeping our heads above water. It was like a punch in the gut. They'd been in deep trouble for years and hadn't even told me. Pride, undoubtedly, but also I suspected a belief that I was somehow incapable of helping. Or maybe they just didn't think I was worth saving. Why didn't you tell me before? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. We didn't think you wanted to hear from us, Mom said quietly, avoiding my gaze. Not after the way things ended. We were wrong. We know that now. The room fell into a heavy silence. Emily squeezed my hand again, grounding me, reminding me that I didn't have to do this. I didn't owe them anything. I looked at her, and she gave me that look, the one that said, "It's your choice. But I believe in you." I thought of everything I had been through. The years of struggle, the bitterness, the endless cycle of work and survival. I had every reason to walk away, to leave them to their fate. I didn't owe them anything, but I wasn't that broken teenager anymore. I had power now, the power to choose who I wanted to be. Finally, I spoke. Okay, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I'll help, but there will be conditions. Bethany raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. Conditions? Yes, I said, meeting her gaze. No more reckless spending, no more clubbing. You'll take financial literacy classes and you'll find a steady job. I'll pay your mortgage for a few months, but after that, you're on your own. She opened her mouth to argue, to protest, but stopped when she saw the look on my face. I wasn't kidding. This wasn't a blank check. This was a lifeline, not a handout. Fine, she muttered, her voice grudging. And as for you two, I said, turning to my parents, we'll set up a proper budget. I'll help with the house payments for now, but you're going to work with a financial advisor to get things back on track. And Dad, that means selling the golf club membership. They both nodded, relief washing over their faces. I could tell they hadn't expected me to agree. They had probably imagined me storming out, cursing them all for their selfishness and stupidity. After dinner, Emily and I left the house. The air outside felt cleaner, fresher. On the drive home, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Anger, pity, hope. I wasn't sure if helping them was the right thing to do. I still resented them for what they'd done. But deep down, I knew I had made the decision for myself, not for them. I'm proud of you, Emily said quietly, her voice full of affection. Yeah, I muttered, staring out the window at the passing scenery. We'll see how long it lasts. But little did I know, that wasn't the end of the story. Something else was about to happen. Something that would test just how far I was willing to go for my family. something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about them and about myself. Over the next few months, things slowly began to change, miraculously, or maybe just predictably, given what I was willing to do. I followed through on my promises, as I always do. I set up automatic payments to cover Bethany's mortgage for the agreed-upon time frame. I got my parents connected with a financial advisor who specialized in helping people recover from financial disaster. I even found Bethany a job. It wasn't glamorous, managing logistics for a local shipping company, but it was a steady paycheck. Ashley even managed to make her own improvements. She signed up for a course on personal finance that she actually stuck with. I couldn't believe it. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were arguments, disagreements, moments when I wanted to tear my hair out. Bethany struggled with the sudden loss of freedom. She missed her nights out, her impulsive shopping sprees. My parents, especially Dad, had trouble letting go of their pride. They were used to being in control, and now they were relying on me for help. But for the first time in years, we talked. Not just superficial small talk, but real conversations. Honest, sometimes painful, conversations about the past, about the present, about the future. Sometimes I'd sit across from my mother in their small, outdated kitchen, sipping lukewarm coffee, and listen to her talk about things I'd never heard before. How hard it had been to raise 2 children while constantly worrying about money. How she had convinced herself that Bethany's success would lift the whole family, while I was considered reliable enough to make it on my own. How she felt like she had failed both of us. She apologized more than once, her voice cracking with emotion. But the pain in her eyes told me she knew it might not be enough. That no amount of apologies could undo the damage that had been done. And Bethany was a puzzle. She had always been a closed book to me, a beautiful, unreadable enigma. She opened up slowly, reluctantly, like pulling teeth. One night, when we were alone, sharing a bottle of wine, something I never thought I'd see us do, she finally admitted something that took me by surprise. "I was jealous of you," she said, looking down at her glass, swirling the wine around and around. I blinked, stunned. "Jealous of me? You were the golden child, Bethany. You had everything." She laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "That's what it looked like, huh? Everyone expected me to be perfect all the time. Mom and Dad didn't care if I was happy, just that I made them look good. They wouldn't even let me go to the college I wanted to go to. They chose one that fit their image, that would make them look good to their friends. I was drowning, Arthur. I didn't know who I was, so I just destroyed myself." For the first time, I saw her as more than just a spoiled, irresponsible sister I'd resented for so long. I saw her as a person, trapped by her own set of expectations, her own set of fears. We had both been trapped by our parents' expectations, in different ways. The difference was that I had fought my way out. She had been crushed under the weight. That conversation softened something in me. Maybe we couldn't erase the past, but we could rebuild from here. We could start to understand each other, to see each other as people, not just as roles in our family drama. A few weeks later, I invited everyone to a company event. It was a charity gala, a fancy affair with celebrities and CEOs and all that jazz. I thought it might help bridge the gap between our lives, to show them what I had accomplished. But mostly, I wanted to show them that it was possible. I figured they'd show up, smile awkwardly for a few photos, and leave early. I certainly didn't expect them to actually enjoy themselves. Instead, the most unexpected thing happened. My father, who had always been stoic and distant, pulled me aside during the event. He looked around at the huge hall, filled with big business leaders and celebrities, and for once, he didn't look overwhelmed. He looked proud. "You've built something incredible here, son," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never told you this, but when I was your age, I dreamed of starting my own business. I wanted to be my own boss, to make something of myself, but I was too afraid to take the risk. To see you succeed like this." He paused, his eyes shining with an emotion I'd never seen before. "You did what I couldn't. I just want you to know that I'm proud of you, Arthur. More than you'll ever understand." It hit me harder than I thought it would. I had spent so many years chasing success, hoping to prove something. To myself, to them, to the world. I didn't realize how much I still craved that validation, that acknowledgement from my father. In that moment, something inside me finally let go. The anger, the resentment, the need to prove myself. It all started to fade away. The night ended on a high note. My parents mingled with people they never thought they'd meet. Bethany even seemed to enjoy herself, laughing and talking with Emily. It felt like a turning point. Like maybe, just maybe, we could move forward. But life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. A way of throwing curveballs when you think you finally got everything figured out. A few days later, I received an urgent phone call from my mother. Dad had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing at home, a heart attack. It wasn't fatal, thankfully, but it was serious enough to shake us all up. I spent the next week at his bedside, sitting through tense conversations with doctors, comforting my mom, who broke down in tears more than once. Bethany was there too, surprisingly supportive, helping with the cooking and cleaning, taking care of Chloe and Leo. That week changed everything. My dad became more thoughtful, more introspective. He started to see the world differently. He admitted that he had spent too many years focusing on the wrong things: status, control, appearances. He was a lawyer, for Christ's sakes. What appearances was he even trying to keep up? "I've wasted so much time, Oliver," he said quietly one night, his voice weak but sincere. "Don't make the same mistake." After he recovered, the family dynamic shifted in ways I hadn't expected. We began to make time for each other. I visited my parents regularly with Emily in tow. Bethany and I actually became close. We even took her kids on some weekend trips to the beach. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own family. I didn't feel like I was constantly having to prove something. And yet, I couldn't quite understand why I'd worked so hard to save our relationship. Why I'd invested so much time, energy, and money into helping them. Was it guilt? A need to atone for some perceived failing? Or maybe some part of me still wanted to believe that family, flawed as it was, could be redeemed. Maybe I wanted my children, when Emily and I decided to have them, to grow up with grandparents and an aunt who loved them. Or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I could rise above the pain and bitterness, that I could be a better person than they were. Whatever the reason, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't that broken teenager anymore. I had rebuilt my life from the ashes of that betrayal, and now I was finally at peace. As we gathered for a family barbecue one warm Sunday afternoon, I stood off to the side, watching my parents laugh with Chloe and Leo, Bethany chasing after them with a water gun. Emily nudged me gently. "You okay?" I smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am."